and you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, and thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I'm happy to have you join us for what we try to do, which is to have heterodox and complex and interesting and sometimes difficult conversations about things that will hopefully help you as an educator better prepare students for the modern world. Speaking of preparing students for the modern world, our professional development services are, of course, all geared towards that, and everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry and personalized to meet the needs of you and your school and your district. So if you are looking for ways to better prepare your students for the modern world, please navigate on over to wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find our workshops and our services, including project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and a whole host of inquiry-centered and student-focused professional development options for your school. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Sheena Mason, who is an assistant professor of African American, American, and Caribbean literature at SUNY Oneonta. She's also co-founder and president of Theory of Racelessness, and also an author of a forthcoming book in early 2022 entitled Decolonizing the Racialist Imagination in Literary Studies, an Interrogation and Critique of Anti-Racist Discourse. And perhaps it's worth issuing an apology and a thank you in advance because of the length of this episode, but full transparency, I have sort of an intellectual crush on Sheena's brain. I love the precision and thoughtfulness she brings to this very important subject and a unique perspective as well. Also, fair warning, as we approach the 127-minute mark, so an hour and 27 minutes into it, I had to go because of a previously scheduled call, and you'll hear us talk about that and refer to perhaps recording a part 2, which we did about a week later and is added to the end of this, which is part of the reason for the overall length. But as you'll hear, I really thought this was a useful and interesting conversation and something that perhaps is worthy of even more discussion. We started our conversation by kind of outlining the philosophies of race, kind of what race is and how people sort of think about that, whether that's naturalism, constructionism, or skepticism, and then what people think we should do with race, which is reconstructionism, conservatism, and eliminativism. I find these terms and categories to be really helpful as we think about race and racism. So we started that conversation on that and then did some definitions of racism and anti-racism, tried to use some examples and maybe some confounding examples as I thought about the various ways in which race and racism sort of shows up in our everyday discourse and interactions. And as educators, I think it's really helpful to think more clearly about the ways in which these things show up in our everyday lives and discourses, especially in our classrooms. So I won't belabor this introduction, especially as the podcast itself is quite long. I hope you do listen to all of it, and I hope you check out Theory of Racelessness and Sheena Mason's work. So again, just as a reminder, at about the 127 mark in, you'll hear us wrap up, and then quickly it'll go to part 2. And I certainly hope you enjoy this conversation and stick around for all of it. All right, welcome. I am here via Zoom with Dr. Sheena Mason, who is going to talk with us and help us think through her theory of racelessness, of which I am eminently and almost infinitely curious about as we sort of think through the sort of culture wars as educators and the ways in which we might help educators sort of think through some of the pieces of race and racism and all of the sort of tendrils that might be attached to them. But before we get into it, Sheena, welcome. And I want to give you an opportunity, as I like to do, to introduce yourself and give a little background. You've got, I think, quite a journey that you can share and will bring us sort of to the current day so we can start talking about some of the things that we want to talk about.
Thank you so much, Drew, and thank you for having me. So, I'm Dr. Sheena Mason. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Oneonta and the president and co founder of Theory of Racelessness and Educational Consulting Business. But I have not just an extensive history in education, but also in business, which is largely what's driving my work through theory right now. Because I'm at my fullest capacity in terms of seeing the divisiveness that's happening, and also in seeing people, usually well-intended people, unintentionally upholding the problem of racism. I would say that my educational spirit and my activist spirit started really as a child. I read voraciously. Reading was really an escape for me because I experienced extensive abuse at my home. I was adopted as a child, and my adoptive parents, again, abused and neglected me. So I really turned to reading as a way to escape my reality. And I had the good fortune of actually having access to any book that I could have wanted, um, which isn't which isn't a privilege that every child gets to have. But fortunately, it was my privilege. And as a result of that, both the abuse and of my reading voraciously, I found myself homeless my senior year of high school, sleeping on park benches. Should have been the best year of my life. I was taking college economics and English courses. I was an honors and AP student. I was a varsity athlete, all of the things. And I actually had to drop out of high school because I had bigger fish to fry. I actually chose sleeping on park benches over staying in that house. And I I believed always that there was more to the world than what I was experiencing. And that was largely because I had access to books. That was because I had access to good education. And it was that belief that then took me to undergrad a year later. I ended up being the student commencement speaker as an undergraduate at my commencement. I wish my sort of troubledness stopped at that point, but it didn't. I remember I spent my 25th birthday in a homeless shelter in East New York, Brooklyn. Um, but then fast forward, I did Teach for America, so I taught 9th through 12th in Houston, Texas. I got my master's degree from the University of Houston. I worked for 24-hour fitness, gym that used to have pre-pandemic, or yeah, pre-pandemic used to have 400 locations nationwide. I worked for them in 5 different states, ending my career in San Jose, California, with a team of just under 100 employees. I was the general manager. So I have extensive business and teaching experience. And then recently, I graduated from Howard University. I earned my doctorate in English literature. I specialize in African American, American, and Caribbean literature. And I passed with distinction and honor reserved for less than 1% of humanities PhDs worldwide. Was a student commencement speaker again, one of 5 keynote speakers this year. And my forthcoming book, Decolonizing the Racialist Imagination, is sort of a byproduct of not just the hardship that I've been through, but also my sincere belief, uh, largely because of my own personal experience in the transformational power and empowerment of education. And I just happen to focus that energy in all things quote unquote anti-racism. Um, and that's also the driving force behind my theory of racistness, because ultimately I've lived the transformative power of education. I believe in it sincerely, and I'm doing everything I can to amplify my voice to help educate people about how they're unintentionally upholding the problem of racism.
Wow, that is an amazing and impressive journey. A couple things I want to pull on this. First of all, you said the forthcoming book, Decolonizing the Racialist. What was the last part?
Imagination.
Imagination. That's what I thought it was. Okay. And if I'm remembering correctly, as I listened to you and watch you talk with other folks, that is at least, has it been submitted? Because I don't know when it
Oh,
was.
yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's being published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I'm expecting an early to mid spring release.
Okay, great, great. And what were you a varsity athlete in? What sport?
Yeah, so I was a varsity cheerleader and then I did track and field.
Okay, and what events?
400 relay was my thing, and
Okay,
occasionally the 800.
okay, all right. I'm imagining you as a cheerleader, and that is not how what I would have put you in, but
Yeah,
that.
I was even a college cheerleader, so yeah, it's in my blood. I love cheerleading.
Wow, that's again, that's not what I would have put you in, but good for you. That's interesting that you. So you, I'd like to hear just a little bit more about the Teach for America experience. I actually, so my listeners will hear that have heard this story before, but my mom was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and I have here in my office my grandmother's teaching contract and a certificate from 1933-34. I'm looking over at it to the right. And in 1933-34, my grandmother made $960 for the year as a teacher. And some of the things that were in her contract were bizarre things, like actually pretty standard for that case or that time, but she could be fired for change in condition, which would be pregnancy, and change of name, which would be marriage. And I always sort of joke and laugh, say that's a terrible HR policy. But anyways, I say all of that to say I actually tried not to become a teacher, and then it just sort of pulled me back in because I actually had moved to Houston, Texas, of all places. My brother was living there, so I lived with him, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And after graduating from Michigan State University and deciding I didn't want to be an attorney or go to law school, and I substitute taught in a school just on the outskirts at that point of Houston. It's probably because it's grown and sprawl has creeped out, but it was just too much. I decided I had to go back and get my teaching certificate, so I did, and I was a teacher for 15 years. But it's funny, we have Houston as an overlapping and intersection here, so maybe Houston is where all great teachers go to get their start, right?
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about the Teach for America experience. What did you teach, and what was that like? And one of the things that's unique about Teach for America is that there's not a sort of teaching pedagogy background, and of course therein lies some criticism and that kind of thing. But what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, but you still have to get certified in the state. So I
Yeah.
feel like it comes in at some point, right? So I taught ELA, and was the ESL supervisor of the other teachers at the charter school that I was at. I would say that my feelings about Teach for America are kind of mixed. I think Teach for America itself is fine, but the charter school I was at actually is where I felt the most um, discomfort. I don't have a better word for it right now.
Hmm.
It was such that it was a last chance charter school, and the founder of the charter school required that all of the teachers did something called the Marquez reading, and it was named after the founder. And the reading, it was something like we had to have a random reading for the day, and we had to cold call students to read a paragraph from the reading, and then we had, between each paragraph, we had to cold call students to give a quote critical detail of from the reading, but the critical detail was simply a different student reading a full sentence from the paragraph, and that was a critical detail, and it was lauded as teaching critical thinking, all of these things. Hopefully people can hear the inflection in my voice as I'm saying this. I really felt like the one benefit that it might have for some students is help improve fluency, which
Mm.
is not the same as improving critical thinking or
Right.
reading comprehension, right? So I that was rough because we were expected to spend 20 minutes from each period doing this Marquez reading, and administrators would come to your class randomly, and you would have to stop the lesson wherever you were, and have students do the Marquez reading. um
Mm.
and yeah, it was it was rough, primarily because of the administration as opposed to the students or Teach for America or anything else, right? Because the administration of the charter school is not Teach for America.
Yeah.
So that was very rough because I at the time I didn't know a whole lot about, proper ways to teach, if there are proper ways to teach, but I did feel like that wasn't it.
Yeah.
And there was so much more that I wanted to help my students with, especially being an English language arts teacher, helping them, especially with their reading comprehension. Like that was the thing that I felt like was going to be crucial to helping them get through not just high school, but also get through college. And I felt like I was doing my students a disservice by, in my mind, wasting time on this Marquez reading.
Yeah.
But the students were absolutely fabulous. I think of them often. I'm still connected with many of them on Facebook. I've seen them grow up and live their lives, and it's been pretty awesome. And so I'm glad for the experience. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad there is an organization like Teach for America doing this kind of work. Since 2018, I've actually been connected with the Freedom Project Network, which was founded by former TFAers. And they do work primarily in the Mississippi Delta and also Eudora, Arkansas. So in 2018, I sort of left my TFA roots where they were, but then went to teach college level courses for college credit to underserved high school students in the Delta. And I did that every summer since 2018, with the exception of 2019 because I was supposed to go, but then surprise, surprise, I got pregnant with triplets. So it was a high risk pregnancy, didn't go. And then this past summer, I was their first program manager, and I actually supervised all of the PhD students and candidates who are teaching the 9th through 12th graders. In that organization, I will say, tried to break away from the TFA model, probably for a reason, because it's definitely not everybody's cup of tea, but I still stand by the fact that they're doing good work, and they're doing work that other people aren't seemingly willing to do.
Right. Well, very interesting, and yeah, I've seen some very good aspects of Teach for America and some that haven't worked out particularly well, but I think that's true of non TFA and education just in general, which we certainly might touch on. But I do want to make sure. So let's go ahead and get into and kind of talk through and get to the meat of our conversation around race and racism and racelessness. I actually first came upon you, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, on a video somebody had shared on the Twitters, I think, from, I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Khadija Mbowe. And she actually has a video from, I don't know when it was, it's not showing here, but it was, Can We Ever Stop Obsessing Over Race? And I think then Theory of Racelessness is in the title as well. And she actually sort of features your work as she very entertainingly talks through various pieces, and she seems like she's having quite a bit of fun, and it is fun to watch and listen to. You're in there, but it's mostly her voice. But one of the things that she talked through there, and I'd like to get you to briefly outline, because I do think it's a helpful framework, as I had said before we started recording, that I had not really thought about before hearing that. And as we sort of frame the conversation about race and racelessness, to think about the sort of philosophies of race and the ways in which those have been outlined and sort of constructed, and the names for them, and the ways that some people can be, I think, at least two of them or some version of that. So if you don't mind, I know you've probably done this a million times, but kind of talk through that. I would talk through it, but I would probably not do it particularly well. So if you don't mind.
Sure. So there are 6 philosophies of race. Every single one of us holds at least 2 of these philosophies, even without having language to say, this is my philosophy of race. 3 of the philosophies speak to what a person thinks race is, and 3 speak to what a person thinks should be done with race. Of the former, there's a category called naturalism. If you're a naturalist, you believe that race is biological, it's in nature. Right now, this has been disproven time and time again for well over a century, but there are still people who cling to the idea that race is biological. Then there's something called constructionism. If you are a constructionist, you argue that race may not be in nature, but it's rendered real. It manifests itself in real ways as a social construction, usually because of the happening of racism. And then there's something called skepticism. Skeptics argue that race is not in nature and it's not a social construction. It doesn't exist at all, full stop. And I am in that category. I am a skeptic. I argue that racism is race. It creates race. It's the same thing. So the thing that people point to and say that's race or that's racial, it's actually racism camouflaging itself, or it's ethnicity, which includes biology, includes ancestry, right? That's the phenotypical thing that people can point to and say exists, but it's not race, it's ethnicity, or it's culture, it's something else. We're misnaming things as race or racial. And in that way, I say we shouldn't believe in the apparition or the unicorn of race. Then there are the three categories that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race. The first and most common one in the United States is something called Reconstructionism. Reconstructionists argue that for whatever reason, the concept of race should be reconstructed. Now, if we actually know anything about the genealogy of the term race itself, then we recognize that, like most words in language in existence, it's been under reconstruction since it came into being. But you have moments like abolition, when Frederick Douglass is trying to reconstruct what it means to be racialized as Black in this country, all the way through the Black Lives Matter movement, where you have BLM activists saying to be Black is to be human. They are reconstructing what it is, what race is, or attempting to anyway. Then there's something called conservationism. Conservationists want to keep the idea of race. Probably conservationists are going to be naturalists because, after all, you can't reconstruct or get rid of what nature provides, right? And then the last category where I fall is something called eliminativism. Eliminativists are often skeptics, but can also be constructionists, like my mentor at Howard University. And eliminativists argue for a variety of reasons that the concept of race itself should be gotten rid of. We should eliminate it, eradicate it, bye bye. As a skeptic, since I argue that the thing people point to and say that's race, it's actually something else, and usually it's racism masquerading itself. To undo racism, we have to undo race. And in that way, I'm arguing that the elimination, what's really being eliminated is racism, not race, because for me as a skeptic, it doesn't exist. But then you have constructionists like my mentor who would operate still within the category of race, ultimately to destroy the category itself, which is a whole interesting, I think, way of seeing oneself in the world. But yeah, those are the 6 philosophies of race.
Well, it is really interesting. Like I said, I'd not, previous to seeing you featured in her video, been privy to that or was aware of that, and it's a really helpful framework. Even if, as I think you joke about the term eliminativism not being particularly the word you would have chosen, but it is what it is, right? And so trying to eliminate that. And I would say I'm more in the sort of a skepticism and eliminativism as well. And I wonder how much of that is part of, I'll use the air quotes of lived experience, right? I mean, I actually had a chance over Thanksgiving to look back, and I'm curious about your journey and, sort of your exposure with people of different quote unquote race and how that may have affected things as well. But like, I looked at I was looking at a bunch of pictures my mom had pulled out, Thanksgiving, what else are you going to do for Thanksgiving, right? You go and see all those things that are if you have them, and unfortunately, some of us, like yourself, probably don't want to go back and look at pictures of childhood. But being able to do that, looking at my childhood elementary pictures, and one of the things that I noticed, which I thought was true, although I hadn't really been able to quantify it because it wasn't terribly important to me at that point, was that almost half of my elementary classes were, was people who would say racialized Black kids, and I grew up in Michigan, small pig farming community, fairly close on the outskirts of Chicago. So, and I had a second grade teacher who was racialized Black. I had an elementary principal who was racialized Black. Many of my friends were folks like that you would describe that way. And so for me, it never, it was obviously something that they were different than I was in some way, shape, or form, but everybody's different than I am in some way, shape, or form. So I wonder how much of that sort of lived experience is affects the way people sort of find themselves in these categories if they were to actually think through that. And so I don't know if you have any insight into that. And also, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and as I understand it, you have some history with Black Lives Matter, right? And so maybe a quick flyover of that journey as well.
Yeah, the lived experience aspect is something I think about often enough. Um, I don't know, but it's complicated because I sometimes I get the sense that some people will point to lived experience to discount and devalue what a person says, mm-hmm. And then other people might look at lived experience as the sort of pinnacle for, right. Yes, this person is right because they've lived it or something like that. So ironically for me, as I circulate, amplify my voice and my knowledge, some people might assume or presume that I haven't lived certain experiences because I think the way that I think.
Right.
Which is so ironic to me because I'm like, you literally know nothing about me. And if you knew anything about me, then you wouldn't be saying what you're saying.
Right.
And it's also having the title doctor, automatically people make all these presumptions. It's as if people who get PhDs didn't live a life before the PhD or something. It's so strange to me. And then that's why I do what I can to share a little bit about my background to show that it's not what you would presume I've been through isn't probably it, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, for me, I've had the good fortune of living in at least 6 different states now, maybe 7, traveled the world, but I grew up in a predominantly racialized white community. My house was the quote unquote brownest house in the town. It was population 1,600, very small town, New York. I experienced explicit and violent racism growing up. I was assaulted on a school bus, called pubic hair, punched, spit on, called the N-word, called Oreo, called all of the things that one would associate with racism, just blatant racism. Mm-hmm. And I was told my own adoptive mother, who was the abuser, she weaponized race against me when I was something like 8 or 9 years old. She said that my father's parents or family didn't like me because I'm Black. This is how she said it. She was an immigrant from Panama. I'm racialized Black. My brother's racialized Black. Our father is racialized white. And so his family is racialized white. So she said that wasn't true, but because she was the abuser, she wanted to disconnect us from his family because she would have been found out. And my grandparents were very suspicious at the time. So she said this evil, hateful thing. But she made it about me because that's how we tend to talk about racism in the US. We make the cause the person who's being discriminated against. It's because you're Black, it's because of your skin color that X, Y, and Z is happening to you. And so those early experiences were very traumatic for me. Didn't understand it because I'm still coming to know myself, right, as a young person. And as I got older, went to college, came to be around other people from all over the country, actually all over the world. I made friends with a lot of international students. I started seeing other things. It was other problems of people telling me that I talk white, right? um, so I start to, again, I'm learning how things work in our society, and that did drive my interest in exploring what race is, how it comes to be essentialized in the ways that it does, what racism is, what it's not, etc. But then as an adult, so for over half of my life, I've been mostly in spaces where it's predominantly racialized Black people. Right. I went to an HBCU for my doctorate. I lived in DC. It's one of the blackest places in the US. And so, yeah, for me, the lived experience thing is like as complex as I would hope for any person, which I think also adds to my credibility because I've lived in a lot of places. I've seen a lot of things. I've met a lot of people, and I've analyzed this on every front, right? Not just in books, but like in human society.
Right.
And then the BLM. So it was like an offshoot of BLM. This was 2016 when I was in California. And it was very short-lived because within 3 or so months of finding the group, I ended up moving to DC to start my PhD. So it was very short-lived. I won't pretend like I did profound or extensive work with them, but it was a connection that I made, and those people, you know, I'll probably never meet more loving people. So I personally don't have anything really profound to say about that experience, except that the Sheena here and now wouldn't join that organization, right? Like that's not what I know now about race and racism would preclude me from participating in those kinds of movements.
Right.
But I'm glad to be connected with those people.
Yeah, it is a really interesting. I mean, I agree with you. The lived experience is not causal. There's lots of correlations, and so it does mean something, but it doesn't mean everything, and it's not a direct line. I'm sure you're aware of. I think it's Bertrand Cooper, his piece in Newsweek, and some of the things talk about lived experience and the ways in which one of the things I think he interestingly points out, and we'll put this in the show notes, and probably don't have time to dwell on this as well, but the idea of a lot of the sort of noisiest folks in this sort of culture war conversation are not people who would have some of the lived experience or to the extent of lived experience of race and racism and things that you have described. Sort of he I think helpfully redefines it in through the lens of class and socioeconomics and in a large part. And I think that's a useful piece of that conversation as well. But it is really difficult. So like you, I am supportive of the overall intent of Black Lives Matter, but then I suppose maybe as a skeptic and an eliminativist, it's hard to really latch onto that in ways that sort of jive with that. Those two things are, it seems to me, a little bit in conflict. And so maybe it's helpful for you, if you would, sort of define racism and anti-racism, because I think, they're obviously in some ways polar opposites, but not necessarily in every single way, right? I mean, there's a credible argument to say that some anti-racists are, in fact, being racist. I'm not sure how you think through that, so maybe you can shed some light into that, and then we'll kind of define theory of racelessness.
Yeah, so yes, you're absolutely right, and that's probably the best part about philosophies of race in the first place, because as with any philosophy of anything under the sun, it's transitory, right? You don't have to be in a fixed category forever and always. Before I started my doctorate, I probably was a constructionist, Reconstructionists, like the vast majority of Americans, I think are really programmed to be. We're not taught the other philosophies of race, and I think that's for a reason. But that's my own conspiracy theory. And it was only after doing the intensive research that one does in a doctoral program that the world kind of opened up to me, and I became a constructionist eliminativist without having the names for it. Was put in touch with the chair of the philosophy department, and then the rest is history. And then about a year ago, I recognized I shifted from constructionism to skepticism. So I say that to say that, you know, I want listeners to feel heartened by the fact that if they find themselves in two particular categories, it doesn't have to stay the same. And it, for the betterment of our society, it probably shouldn't.
You mean we can evolve our thinking?
Yeah, we can.
This is blasphemy.
Oh, isn't that so sad? But so sad that one has to say that, like, yeah, this is transitory. So defining racism. So for me, what's interesting is if we take somebody like Ibram X. Kendi's definition of racism, one would say something to the effect of racism is the belief that any race group is superior or inferior to another race group. That's how he says it in How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Now, for me, that definition, which is the most commonly accepted definition, is redundant because race is the hierarchy. So my definition of racism is simply the belief in race. It's the belief in this notion that human beings are born into separate and distinct categories. And for me, because race is the hierarchy, it is racism, it's redundant to word it in the way that Kendi does. So that to me is racism, which then means that anti-racism for Kendi or Kendian thinkers, right, it's going to be something to the effect of, to be anti-racist is to be actively against the belief that any race group is inferior or superior to any other race group. Anti-racism to me is being anti-race. It's being against the belief in race, the belief that there's more than one human race, which has been scientifically disproven, but then also requires the recognition that what people point to and say that's race or racial, we're actually mistaking other things, right? And it's a critical distinction because I think that's how most people unintentionally uphold the problem of racism, even as defined by somebody like Kendi, right? Because if you're working from that framework, if you're working from a constructionist, reconstructionist framework, constructionism falls short in countless ways because you have these people who say race doesn't exist, it's man-made and was made just to subjugate people, right? Okay, check. But by the way, I'm Black and you're white. You know, it's like, okay, so we still buy into the one drop rule, the metaphorical blood, as Barbara and Karen Fields call it. We still buy into the belief that although a social construction, race has something to do with how a person looks. It's inescapable. It's how, you know, it's ancestry. It's my parents, it's my grandparents, and so on and so forth. So we still believe that race is of nature, but we call it a construction. And for me, that's one of my primary points of contention with constructionist positions and why I try to educate people on skepticism as much as possible, even though it is challenging, admittedly, for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, because I don't think constructionism gets us to the end goal of really freeing ourselves from the problem of racism. It just doesn't. We can see, we don't have to go far to see how digging into race identity in quotation marks is actually lending toward more racism and more resentment and the upholding of the hierarchy than anything else that we could possibly do. So that's my that's my 2 cents about how I define racism and anti-racism,
Mm-hmm.
and why constructionism doesn't get us to the end goal, and reconstructionism won't either, because if we define racism in the way that I've outlined, or even if we define it as Kendi does, by teaching race, right, by pigeonholing people into the category of race, we're pigeonholing them into racism.
Mm-hmm.
So we're upholding the same thing we're saying we ironically want to dismantle. You can't have your cake and eat it too in this instance.
Right, and you made reference to Karen and Barbara Fields in the book that is something that I would recommend and have recommended to everybody is called Racecraft. I think it's the soul of inequality in American life or something.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know if I'm getting that exactly right, but it's a great read, and they've got there's a few articles and pieces that but they're largely out of the public eye. But you're obviously pulling from a lot of their work, or at least similar threads, and folks should find that. It's it is really interesting the ways in which, because it's not something that we can, I mean, in sort of theory in your head, or at least in my head, like, it's easy enough to say, and maybe it's not easy enough, but it's sort of ideally easy enough to say to people, but wait, like, you're talking about things that are not real. And that's sort of the message of Racecraft. Like, witchcraft there's no such thing as real witches, right? So we're talking about them as though they are real. And so we're talking about race as though it's real. And so stop talking about race. And, therein lies the gap between, theoretically, which I think most people could probably get to, of like, okay, I understand what you're saying, and that makes sense to me, that race is a social construct, it's biological, it's not biological, it's not real. I can join you theoretically in skepticism and let's get rid of it, but that's not how it plays out, right? In reality and in practice, we see evidence of people practicing racism, which is based in, I'm looking at it on my notes here of right to left, skepticism and eliminativism being further to the right, and naturalism and reconstructionism being on the left. So, the further you are to that left, there, it seems like that's where we see the racism show up. And so, and to be clear, and I think it's probably important to be clear, and unfortunately important to be clear, you've talked about it or dipped your toes in it already, but like, you're not at all saying that there is no racism, that there's no such thing as systemic racism or any version of that. You talked about things that have happened to you that are evidence of that. So how do you think we can bridge that gap? And perhaps this is where theory of racelessness comes in.
Yeah, so that's important to point out, right? A lot of the question I get very often is, how is this different from color blindness? Well, people's primary contention with color blindness is often because people who profess themselves to be colorblind also discount or diminish the problem of racism, or even the existence of racism.
Right.
Not all the times, but often enough for it to be a point of contention for people, right? Mm-hmm. Theory of racelessness is different in profound ways that from color blindness, not just in the fact that I'm pointing to and saying, okay, racism exists, right? That's not a point that I would discount, but also because color blindness operates from the premise and the belief in race still, which to me is racism, that there's something to be ignoring, that there's something to look the other way about, right? I can see your race, which skin color has mm-hmm. become a proxy for race. Mm-hmm. I can see it, but I'm not going to treat you any differently because of it. Mm-hmm. So there's no fundamental change in how a person sees themselves in the world. They still believe in race, so they know the hierarchy. So we're trying to coach people into or to convince ourselves into not buying into our certain biases, right? Mm-hmm. The theory of racelessness helps people discover themselves outside of the box of racism altogether, meaning this is a way to teach people that they are actually raceless. So it's something you said earlier, I want to emphasize is that many people might be able to concede the point, okay, yeah, race is a social construction, da 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 da, da, and they might go into skepticism. But as a skeptic, I'm like, no, race is not a social construction. It literally doesn't exist.
Right. I knew as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, she's going to get me on that one.
I did. And it's hard for before I became a skeptic, I didn't exactly know the difference between skepticism and constructionism. I would say the definition of skepticism, but I didn't really know. And I had already defended my dissertation. I read the book Racecraft. Mm-hmm. So Racecraft came to me after I'd already had my whole ideas. Like my book was written, and then I revised my book to include the concept because I was like, oh, this is actually a helpful tool. And I should have read the book sooner because admittedly a professor had been recommending it for like years. But I was like, Racecraft, it's on the very long reading this, right? It is a pivotal book because my students have identified the Field Sisters as being skeptics and certainly eliminativists, even if they are constructionists. Through theory of racelessness framework, instead of telling people, okay, you're racialized, you are white, you're black, you're Asian, etc., you're helping people step into and recognize their own racelessness and other people's racelessness with the express purpose of helping them see the problem of racism more clearly, because none of us can really see the problem clearly if we're still in the fishbowl that race ideology, or what I call racialist ideology, creates for all of us. If you are in the category of white, you're expected to do this sort of self-flatulating, I'm white, I have white privilege. What I say matters less compared to you, a black person, and all this other stuff. It's very deferential. It's very, to me, it's very strange. To me, it seems so obviously racist, not towards racialized white people, but towards people who aren't racialized as white, because as if we have to be coddled, or as if you always have to defer to us. It's so nonsensical and overreaching to me, but that's the way that we're practicing it now. And then if you're racialized as black or of color, in quotation marks, the expectation is, and the assertion is, race matters. It matters no matter what. And we want everyone else in the entire universe to recognize that race matters so much to us, because we conflate race with culture and ethnicity and all the things. Race literally has come to mean everything under the sun in some ways. And so in this way, you can start to see how we are unable or less able to avoid the pitfalls racism and racialist ideology creates for us, because we're insisting on identifying racism from within the problem. So literally, we're training ourselves where you see race, which newsflash is everywhere, where you see race, racism is automatically in there. That's why with the Kyle Rittenhouse stuff, with the Ahmaud Arbery, with all of with Trump, it's like if something bad happens to a racialized black person and the perpetrator is a racialized white person, it's automatically perceived to be racism. Automatically, there's no questions. It's not an if or or and, it's automatically racism. And in this way, we are not clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't. And I think there's a danger in encouraging people to think that racism is everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's global. It's worldwide. White people rule the world. Like, it's so, to me, that should be so obviously racist because it's not true. And the reason why helping people outside of those categories through something like theory of racelessness is because number one, it liberates a person from seeing themselves in that racialized sense, and which is important, because if racism is hiding itself as race, we should want to see ourselves outside of racism, right? But then we also want to free people from some of the angst and the hurt, and also the anger and the confusion, all of these feelings that come along with seeing racism everywhere and thinking it's everywhere. That's not good for any of our psyches, especially because it's not true.
Right.
Right. And so yes, it's a balance of racism exists, but it's not what we think it is, right?
Mm.
And the way that we get to the capital T truth, if we're interested in the truth and not just performing goodness or truth, right? If we're interested in the truth, then how we get to the truth is by seeing ourselves and other people as raceless. And from there, we can start to translate race. My friend calls me the race translator. Translate race where we see it happening, to be more clear-eyed about what it is that is happening and what racism is, because we can't solve anything that ails our society if we're misidentifying it. And we certainly can't solve racism if we think it's everywhere and it's not.
Right. Well, so there's a few things that maybe might be helpful here. So one is, you talk about, we see George Floyd, which is clearly obvious, a tragedy, but taken, and most people would say that is the impetus for sort of the racial reckoning and what we've seen in large part over the last year and a half or two, or I don't know exactly the timing. There's certainly some other incidents as well, and maybe we can talk about Rittenhouse and Ahmaud Arbery and any other folks, but the media, it seems to me, is very guilty of what you're saying, of if there's a black person, a white person, racialized black and racialized white, and I don't even I've come to really have an aversion to saying, oh, black person and white person, right? I mean, it just, because I am so literal and rational, it's I don't want to say things that are untrue, and it's just to say that those terms at this point seem to be absurd. But I see, and on a larger scale, I've seen here, and I've pushed back a little bit at the Louisville Courier-Journal. And there was a story of a teacher who, it was weird. I don't remember the exact specifics, but she had some sexual inappropriate behavior with students. She was a substitute teacher, or maybe she was a regular teacher. Anyways, she had taught in the district where I used to teach, which is not primarily racialized black, and then had moved to Louisville and was teaching in Jefferson County in a school that was primarily or overwhelmingly majority racialized black. And she had this problem as a racialized white person in a racialized black school, and the story was newsworthy. But what was really interesting was that the local news education reporter felt it important to note that she was a white teacher teaching in a black school. And I was like, why is that important? And she said, well, if you don't understand why it's important, I don't know, she didn't say we're done talking, but it was sort of that. I was like, how, that's not important to this story, right? And so if we think about it in sort of the larger landscape in media, and my hypothesis or assertion is that there's no doubt that there is still racism in this world. I have no ifs, ands, and buts about that. Is it better or worse than it used to be? I think evidence and data would show that in almost every marker it is better than it used to be. Certainly better than it used to be 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago, right? But talk about 10, 20 years ago, and maybe we can have a discussion about that. But the way that the media has treated it, it is as though it is as big a problem as it ever was. And I'd be happy to discuss and argue with anybody about that, and I'd be happy to be wrong about that. But then there's another level, of our personal interactions, right? And how we interact with one another that I think might be useful too. And I'm curious, when I see somebody who is not racialized white, or doesn't have the same skin color and some of the characteristics that I have, I notice that, because how could we not, right? I mean, I notice that your skin is darker than mine. It's pretty obvious, right? And so one thing that I definitely do is to make some maybe not assumptions, but there's more. I would say that I would look at somebody and say, all right, I'm gonna bet that there is a higher likelihood that they have experienced some things with regards to racism that I have not. One of my very best friends is his dad's Fields would say Afro-American. I think you say African-American. And then his mom is Korean. And I know that he has had things happen to him that I have not, that are very likely as a result of the color of his skin. And so how we interact and make some of those assumptions. So I might make some assumptions and then want to test them and say, all right, let's see if this person has experienced those things or not. And hopefully they haven't, right? Hopefully they have not experienced a significant amount of racism. And I would do the same thing with, there's stereotypes that we do sort of put with different cultural or race phenotypes or whatever, blah, 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 that I think people certainly make some assumptions. And then can we break through those? Because some of them might be, Asian Americans do really well in school. There's a culture of Asian American, history of, sort of very disciplined academic performance and those kinds of things. So you might have those in the background perhaps, and then can we test them to see if those are, as an individual, if they actually apply to you or don't apply to you. So I don't know how that lands with you and in the ways in which that might be different for you. And because that's a difference in interactions from sort of the media, the way that the media treats it, right?
Yeah, so the first thing that stands out to me is like what we see when we look at each other and we see phenotypical differences is still not race. So I just want to say that.
Right.
And not that you're saying it's race,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
I just want listeners to hear me when I say it's not race.
Right.
It's ethnicity. It's something else, which
Right.
we should not conflate. But also Toni Morrison, one of my favorite writers and one of my favorite quotes from her, she says something to the effect of, when you're walking down the street and you see a person and you can tell that they are from a race, A is in the letter A, race. That's still not the same as knowledge. That's not penetration of character or personality or anything. You don't know anything about a person
right.
based on the race that you assign to them when you see them, or that they self-assign if they tell you what they are, right? Mm-hmm. This is important because this is true even for something called the Black experience. Like when I heard you talking about how based on our skin complexions, one might assume that one of us has had negative experiences with racism compared to the other. I'm like, okay, that's generally put, that's something called the Black experience. When people talk about the Black experience, they're talking about the experience of people negatively impacted by racism in a society that's viewed to be racist. Mm-hmm. Now, this falls apart for me for a lot of reasons. One, because race is signifying in there, right? Like the Black experience. But also because there has never been and there will never be a consensus among racialized Black people in the United States about what racism is or what it's not. Does it happen? Does it not happen? Like, there's not even a consensus among the group that's supposed to be most negatively impacted by the thing. Mm-hmm. And there are countless racialized Black people who will tell you they've never experienced racism and that they probably will never experience racism for a host of reasons, right? Like, it's important to say not experienced it on a one-on-one, like personal level, but then also not experienced it what people would say systemically either. Mm-hmm. And then those same people would then probably often be lambasted as denying, racism, or just not being aware of when they experience racism, which doesn't it strike anyone odd that the mantra for anti-racism is often listen to Black voices, but then it's only listen to the Black voices who tell you what you already believe and want to hear. So I think that those kinds of presumptions, even though they seem innocuous, the presumption that I might have experienced racism compared to a person who's racialized as white, who presumably can't or won't experience racism according to today's standards. To me, it's those kinds of presumptions seem innocuous, but fall apart at the roots and are more evidence for me about how racism masquerades itself as race, both in the sense that the Black experience is often understood within a racist framework, an ideology, which I think is problematic because we existed before racism, we exist after racism, like it's a thing. But then also because racialized Black people, if we actually listen to more voices than the ones that are pushed by the media, who are really complicit in a lot of this divisiveness, would tell you that they haven't experienced it, or would tell you that some will tell you it doesn't exist anymore. It has existed historically, but it's not systemic anymore. Or, you know, people like John McWhorter would tell you something to the effect of racism happens, but it doesn't matter, or it matters less in certain contexts and it matters more in these contexts. Like we have a very complex, we being racialized Black people have a very complex way of understanding and thinking about and talking about the problem. So it becomes so ironic to me at how historically this has always been the case. The voices who don't uphold the mainstream narrative are the voices who get marginalized, excluded, voices like mine. Okay. And that continues the persistent upholding of the problem of racism, because we're not even listening to all of the people contributing to the conversation. And I think that the media is just, my primary field of specialization is African American literature. So in my forthcoming book, I use literary studies as a case study to apply my theory of racelessness. And I also give a genealogy of African American thinkers who were constructionist eliminativists or skeptical eliminativists. And that work hasn't been done before in literary studies. So I think it's interesting to think about how in academia this happens, this marginalizing and excluding of basically half of the so-called Black voices who aren't upholding the mainstream accepted narrative, right? It happens in academia and literary studies and philosophy, and it happens through the media, because the media will, okay, let me give a concise example. So in literary studies, you have people like Morrison who talk about how the default presumption for a lot of non-racialized language is white. So she thinks about the word American, that default presumption was referring to a white person, specifically a white male, especially the further back you go, right? But then you have people like Langston Hughes, who interprets Countee Cullen's assertion that he doesn't want to be a Negro poet, he wants to be simply a poet, as Countee Cullen wanting to be a white poet. So it's like the absence of the race signifier has always been presumed to signify white and whiteness. And the media has aligned with that line of thinking. Up until recently, I noticed that if it's a white person, they won't say white. It'll just be whatever the person's name or the person's profession. It'll just be like the person. But if it's a first Black fill in the blank or something, then race is signified. Right. Or if it's a Black person and a white person, the race is always signified. If the claim is racism, even if the Black person is removed from the story, the 3 white men that killed Ahmaud Arbery were sentenced today, right? It's like they'll throw the race card, throw the race card in if the proclamation and assertion is racism. And what is race doing in a lot of these stories? It's really meant to ignite and inflame and invoke certain feelings from people depending on who the person is and where the person is coming from as they're reading the case. So it either has you feeling up in arms and angry and upset and hurt and all of the things, or it has you feeling defensive. Right? Like people get defensive reading that kind of stuff, depending on how you're racialized and how you racialize yourself. And because the media does this, it's also a way for the idea of race to be naturalized in our imaginations, because we're not often looking at it from a critical lens. We're looking at it as matter of fact. They're just stating the facts, right? These men are white and that person is Black. So it's this constant cycle of a fair amount of people speaking out against racialization, right? Because they recognize racism as race. And then it's a sort of refrain of other people responding, but race is real and it matters because racism exists, which is also my evidence for how it's the same thing. Because if race only exists because of racism, then hello, it is the same thing. Um, and then the voices that get silenced are the ones who aren't going along with the tide or whatever. It's like it's this horrible cycle, but I feel confident that the more people talk about it, the more we can get ourselves out of it.
Right. So what comes to my mind as you're talking through that is this sort of increased dangerous us versus them dynamic that we see, which is not exclusive to race and racism, and that it's right and left, it's trans issues, you name it, any of the issues. It's you and I have both talked or are friendly with Angel Eduardo and his one thought rule of like one single thought that goes against the sort of orthodoxy means you've got to be on the them side, right? Which is a very powerful dynamic that the media seems to be leveraging pretty significantly on both sides of sort of, if you want to say, left and right. And so as teachers then thinking about, and this is one of the things that I've tried to maintain as much as possible, a dispassionate perspective and way and approach to critical race theory, for example. So I don't think in sort of the root of critical race theory that it is what's going to bring us to the promised land, right? It's not how we transcend the problem of race and racism. It does present some interesting frameworks from which to ask some interesting questions. And as a lover of inquiry and the application of liberal science, of which I have said on a number of occasions, we should be advocating for and insisting that that's what's happening in our schools and in societies, that we are criticizing all of the ideas, including our own, and that process gets us closer to the truth, right? And so the sort of foundational question, as I understand it, maybe you understand it differently, of critical race theory, for example, and an illiberal application, and some people would say critical race theory is inherently illiberal. I'm not sure if I agree with that 100%, but maybe, is that, the question is, where is the racism versus is this racism, or is this an example of racism? And so that to me seems to be one of the central ways in which teaching and teachers inside and outside of race might be really struggling with, let's talk about Rittenhouse or Arbery or Ibram X. Kendi or the 1619 Project, Nicole Haddon-Jones, or the idea of patriotism. All of those things, like, is this an example of versus where is it? And because we know it's there, we have to find it, and it's just a matter of finding it. And so as teachers, put yourself back in your ELA classroom, and you don't have to do your prescribed curriculum. They're not coming in to watch you. Right? You've got all the time in the world, and so how might you let's assume that Rittenhouse. Let's use those as examples because they're sort of in some ways sort of polar opposites, and obviously in the current events. Whether or not it's relating to your ELA curriculum, we can set that aside. It probably could in some ways. But how would you maybe approach that, or suggest teachers approach something like that? Or if you want to use a different example, feel free to as well.
Yeah, so all of my classes, I start off by building the foundational knowledge of philosophies of race, because I cannot understate the simple educating and presenting of information. The students will then be free to think as they may as we proceed. But because most people are starting from the default presumption of progressivism, which I think comes with a particular ideology, liberalism, which comes with a particular ideology, people start from that presumption, which then necessitates a constructionist, reconstructionist framework and way of viewing oneself and their classmates. So by presenting in a meaningful way the other philosophies of race, and I almost always include the book Racecraft, at least the introduction and first 2 chapters. um, this lays the foundation for deeper thought and interrogating everything in the class, because at the end of the day, I think what's discouraged, it's so strange to me, but what's discouraged is an interrogation and a questioning of literally everything.
Right.
And my students come away from my class saying the mantra, like, question everything, Dr. Mason. I'm like, yes, like, if you don't learn anything else in my class, that's what I want you to learn, because you will never, even if you question your own ideas and you come to the same conclusions, right? Like, at least you tested your ideas. At least you can know that or you can at least be more confident that what you believe is right or true in any meaningful way. So when I lay that foundation, then when it comes to talking about these other contemporary examples that we could point toward, or when students ask me about it, which they often do, it becomes a situation where, like with the Rittenhouse example. So listen, you have a lot of people saying he's a white supremacist, he's racist, and he's guilty. My students know that one can be racist. Translation, one could be a white supremacist. I don't use that term actually, but since that's the term being applied to him, one could be a white supremacist and also still be innocent of the crime. Like, it doesn't preclude him regardless of his history, if he wore some kind of like just outrageous insulting t-shirt and there's a picture of it and all sort of stuff, that stuff actually doesn't matter when it pertains to the facts of the case. And the fact that he's there at a Black Lives Matter protesting the protesters, right? That's his American liberty and freedom to do that. And just because he's 17, just because he's human, so he makes mistakes, again, doesn't mean that he's guilty or should be convicted of the crimes that were put towards him, right? And just because he was acquitted is not evidence of racism, of America's racism, because I could point to you 100 or more other cases very similarly set up from today all the way to a year ago of people who are racialized Black who got acquitted on similar charges based on self-defense, right? Like, you cannot point to this one example and say that this upholds the narrative of racism. I mean, I saw people crying about it on social media. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm really not. And it's like, I have empathy for people who feel this way, because I understand how we get to that place. And I was once there. Right. It has been a journey for me. But once you have more insight in a different toolkit to work from, which really starts with the foundational understanding of other philosophies of race and viewing yourself as raceless, you stop seeing racism everywhere. I think it is inherently dangerous for us to teach our children and to accept the idea for ourselves as adults that racism is everywhere. It's not. And I would agree with, I forget the name of the person that you mentioned earlier. Bertrand Cooper. He says he ties it to class, right? That is really true, because a lot of people are up in arms about this thing called systemic racism, because they imagine all poor people to be Black and all Black people to be poor, right? That's become conflated in our country.
Right.
And there might have been a time where that was closer to true, where the vast majority of so-called Black people were poor. But if we look at the numbers in 2021, we find it's something like 25 to 30% of racialized Black people live below the poverty line, and they comprise only 20.1% of poor people. Indigenous people make up 25%. They make up the majority compared to the other groups. And so there's this narrative of Black people are poor, and because they're poor, we're also more violent. It's not true. 2.5% of racialized Black people commit violent crimes. But if you look at the media, and that's where you get your information and accept it as truth, they'll spin the numbers this way. They'll say Black people commit 6 times more violent crimes than white people. but nobody asks, what is the 6 being multiplied by? Now, if it's being multiplied by 10 or something, then wow, that's significant. Like, wow, we need to do something about that. But it's 0.25 of racialized white people, 220 plus million, are commit violent crimes. So the number for so-called Black people is 2.5%. But listen to the media, you're not going to know that. You're just going to hear, oh, Black people are poor and they're more violent. And depending on if you're left, you'll say it's because of the system. Depending on if you lean right, you'll say it's because of an inferior culture. Right? But very few people are actually doing an unbiased look at cases like Rittenhouse or the statistics and the numbers, right, which would tell you that actually it's not that I say that racism is not systemic. I think racism is systemic, but not in the ways that people presume. I think it's systemic because we teach race. Right? And it's everywhere. We're confronted with race everywhere. Everywhere we turn, media everywhere. It's everywhere. But if we look at how racism was systemic before in terms of impoverishment and those kinds of things, then we are in a vastly different place now in society, to where people are looking for racism everywhere, right, without even really realizing it. Like Colin Kaepernick grinds my gears because, listen, I watched Colin in black and white, and I was like, wow, he really made everything about racism. Like literally that documentary, everything is about racism. And you have people like Oprah, a billionaire. Listen, money doesn't make people happy. That's a true statement. But you have Oprah Winfrey, who has accomplished a lot in her life, saying, oh, I might be a billionaire, but don't feel bad for poor white people because they still have their whiteness. So you believe in the hierarchy then of white supremacy. Like you believe in it. And the only and the primary way that we get ourselves out of this quagmire is stop encouraging people to see themselves divided from themselves and other people, is by encouraging them to recognize their racelessness. I'm telling you, I've gotten tremendous testimonials and feedback from people that I work with and my students who say they never were presented with the information that they get in my classes until my class, and they cannot go back to thinking how they used to. And they're better able to listen to people who they viewed before as me versus them, right? Me versus you. If you're on the left, I view the right as my opponent and vice versa. Right. They are, I'm telling you, the smoke is cleared from their eyes in those circumstances, in all of the ways that we think of each other as enemies. Right. And I think that's what makes racialist ideology that pernicious, is because it encourages a black and white, pun intended, way of thinking and viewing oneself in the world. And then it applies and transfers over into these other very binary me versus you ways of thinking. And that's why we can't come together. We won't come together under this framework. It's not working. And imagine a classroom, if you're a 12th grader, imagine a classroom in which you're presented with an alternative toolkit, where you are encouraged to see your humanity before you see anything else. And you're encouraged to see not just your phenotypical differences, but who you are on the inside as being, shockingly to most people, similar to other people who don't look like you. Right. That is powerful, because right now race ideology precludes people from doing that. It's
yeah.
You can't tell I'm impassioned.
Yeah, no, your the tenor of your voice definitely changed in that last session, and yeah, and I'm right there with you. You're preaching to the choir, and it's increasingly hard, I think, to sort of navigate the sort of landscape, especially with media. I mean, so it's some of the things you mentioned with stats and areas or neighborhoods of poverty being more violent, and that's true, not just in, racialized Black communities, but in racialized white communities or other. I mean, poverty does lead to some of those kinds of problems. But then, like we see so many examples, and, of course, social media and even media is really great at pointing out all of the examples which are outstanding. I mean, the Rittenhouse case being a good example. Like, this is one in a panorama of many cases that have similarities, but we only see really that one brought to prominence for whatever reasons. And, so I see, and I'm sure you've seen them too, these videos of somebody who's racialized Black in a nice neighborhood who is socioeconomically not depressed, and yet they're being pulled over by and potentially, arguably being harassed by the police or some version of that. And that's real. Like, that does happen. There's a rhetorical sleight of hand, and I'm not sure, honestly, how to navigate it. It seems, I mean, surely that happens to white people. We know it happens to white people or to other people who are not Black or white. It happens. To the extent that it happens more to somebody who has darker skin seems intuitively true, but it's awfully hard to tell at this point. And that epistemic crisis that we're in, I think, is part of the problem here. It's really just almost impossible with a number of issues to really know what's actually true and real, and it's misleading at worst, and untrue at maybe at worst, that those are the things that pop up. And so, one of the things is I was thinking about how we, in preparation for this conversation, was, thinking through a lens of psychology. And I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Barry Kaufman. He's does a psychology podcast, and he wrote a book that I'm sure you're familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Self-actualization being at the top. And his book is I think called Transcend. And so he sort of reframes it and redefines it and says, let's actually add another layer, which is transcend, which is essentially what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to transcend the sort of ideology or idea of race, right? So we don't have time to get into it for sure, and I'm not even sure that we're prepared to get into it, but I'd actually love to see you talk with Scott Barry Kaufman and talk about the ways in which this, like, is there a hierarchy, or is that maybe the right framework, or some version of that, where we can actually, the philosophies of race sort of starts to get to it, right? At the sort of top, if you think of it as a triangle of skepticism and eliminativism, and as if theoretically, I think in your opinion, and it seems true to me, that if we can get people to that position, or those positions, then they transcend the actual racism, right? Because race no longer exists, and now we don't have racism. We'd have all kinds of other problems because we're humans, right? But at least we can work on that problem. So, I don't know how we get to, or if you've had any thoughts about sort of a hierarchy, or sort of, we haven't used the language of transcendence, but I'm curious to your thoughts on that as we start to wrap up, because I do have to go, unfortunately, because I'd love to keep talking forever.
Yeah. If you can't tell, I have a gift for gab, so I could also keep talking forever.
Same.
So, yeah, I think people ask me a lot. It's like, okay, so how do we do this? It's not. I want to say it's not that complicated, right? How ideas get out there in the first place, you just reverse engineer it, and you put other ideas out there.
Sure, easy enough.
Right. It's super easy. Unfortunately for, people like myself, money helps ideas get out there, right? It makes money to show the Rittenhouse case in a particular way. That makes those people money. It makes money for the Ibram X. Kendis or the Robin DiAngelos to go around and tell white people how racist they are.
$10 million from Twitter, or from Jack Dorsey.
Listen, it's like, that's the irony of all of this too, which I don't think gets exposed enough. It makes money to uphold the status quo, and then it comes packaged as progressive, which is super ironic to me. One of my friends calls it faux liberalism. And so it takes money to combat that to a certain extent, because it's not just a matter of me amplifying my voice, or folks who think like me amplifying their voices and their knowledge. It's really about having the monetary support to get into different industries and schools and schools of thought and things like that, because ultimately a lot of organizations got on the DEI or anti-racism train, and a lot of schools are doing the same thing because they think that they're supposed to. They think it sounds right, so they're like, yeah, this is right. So they're doing it right, and the people who are bringing in that information, the constructionist, reconstructionist stuff, are getting bukus of money for bringing them that information, and the schools don't want a lawsuit. Businesses don't want lawsuits, right? They're trying to do this to protect themselves from liabilities is really what it comes down to. So to try a new path seems really scary, and that's the hill that I have to climb, right? Because I have to be persuasive enough to help people see and recognize that actually what I'm bringing to the table is not political, and it gets more people what they want. We actually get to recognize and analyze the problem of racism through this type of framework and thinking, but we get to avoid being part of the problem at the same time, right? And we get to avoid upholding the sort of divisiveness that we see playing out. And it really is, as it sounds really simple, but it is as simple in many instances of simply educating people about these alternative philosophies of race. And then they're going to take with it what they will. But I've done 1 hour sessions, 2 hour sessions, I've done 8-week and one-on-one programs with people, and they say it's literally life-changing regardless of the length, just getting the information, right? So it's not, and then we all have free will and agency. So if we feel compelled enough by an idea, which the vast majority of participants do, then we go and we continue to do the research, right? And then you find Sheena Mason's podcast. I have a whole library of information there. You find Bertrand Coopers of the world, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Angel Eduardo. You find all of these other people who are like-minded and doing similar things, and then you come to have your own enlightenment moment. I think it can literally be that I think it can literally be that easy, right? And I think that the people who are willing, it's just a matter of people being willing to hold their feet to the fire, to risk being wrong or sounding racist or sounding crazy, to think about these ideas out loud, to do more research, and to do a sort of spiritual and emotional journey of imagining themselves outside of the box of racism, and what would that person look like, right? Yeah. And how would you feel, and who are you outside of racism, and who's my neighbor outside of this box too. Yeah. And if we can do that, I think we're closer to that than we think, because we do have a good amount of people who already subscribe to sort of colorblindness and the colorblind ideology, and they tend to interact with theory of racelessness fairly easily because it enables them and empowers them to acknowledge the problem of racism while not being the problem of racism, and so and then it can help us actually solve the problems that ail our society. But so long as we can continue to insist on misnaming the problem and seeing the problem everywhere, we will stay in this quagmire.
Yeah, one of the things that you alluded to, I don't think you used this word, but I think it's pretty clear, is sort of a level of courage, and as it's very clear that people are afraid of being called racist, right? That is one of the worst things that somebody could be called. And in some ways, I'm not certainly ever advocating that somebody be racist, right? But we have to get past that fear. And, I have tried in my Twitter interactions to sort of bridge that gap, and also, to explicitly say to people, whether it's around racism or whatever, is say, look, I'm not your enemy. Like, stop drawing smaller circles and putting everybody in their circles. Draw bigger circles and have us all be in the same circles. We all have individual differences, and there are certainly smaller circles within, but we all are the human race. And I remember there's a particular educator who I've interacted with quite a bit, and most of it was in good faith, although it got a little bit hairy, and you have to really keep your sort of wits about you to not respond with nastiness and ad hominem and that kind of thing. But the sort of opening salvo was, I saw seen a tweet that said something like, basically, you're racist or anti-racist, and my response was a question, which is kind of typically my MO, which is, which kind of anti-racism, which was immediately met with real, let's talk about skepticism. We're like, wait a minute, this guy is he's one of those all lives matter guys, like, and that is a real dynamic to sort of overcome and navigate as well. So we have to, one, commit to good faith conversation and not use ad hominems and not make the assumptions, steel man, star man, again, referring to Angel and Eduardo, but be, first of all, you have to have some courage, but you also have to sort of know enough to be asking the questions that will help navigate the situation or the landscape productively. It's not, again, I try to say liberal science in what we should be advocating for. So trying to figure out, how do I understand what that person is thinking and saying, and how do I help them understand what I'm thinking and saying? And it's not a matter of I'm trying to convince them that I'm right, per se, but that interaction of understanding can help persuade somebody, and it may not. Like I have started, leaving some Twitter interactions saying, I'm not here to argue. I'm not interested in arguing. If you want to have a discussion and talk about understanding, then by all means, I'm happy to do that. But I know you probably want to respond to that, but I have to get off to a call. Unfortunately, this is bad scheduling because I want to talk more. So we've got theoryofracelessness.org, and we'll, of course, put this in the show notes and the things on WeGrowTeachers.com. If you're listening on iTunes, you got to go to our website because Apple iTunes doesn't make links live. So theoryofracelessness.org. And I know you have Twitter. Actually, you have a couple Twitters, right? You want to share those and any other things, parting shots?
Sure. Twitter, at Racelessness, and also at Sheena Mason, PhD. Thank you so much for having me, Drew. We should definitely do a part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, well, welcome back to part 2, one of the rare part 2s, and we couldn't stand leaving it where it was because there's so much to talk about, and we've even talked about making it a regular thing, but we'll see if that happens. But I'm back here with the esteemed Dr. Sheena Mason, Theory of Racelessness, part 2, and hopefully you've listened to part 1. If not, go listen to that one because hopefully we won't be redundant. It's been about a week since we last talked, and it could be that we talk about some things that we talked about before. But Sheena, welcome back officially. And I want to maybe get this conversation to focus maybe a little bit more on the practical and functional, especially as our audience, as I understand it, or hope, or assume, is educators mostly. So, like, how does this really land itself and manifest itself, this conversation, this thinking, and your thinking and theory of racelessness with schools and teaching and learning and all of those things? So maybe a good place to start is the question about teaching Black history, quote unquote Black history, or scare quotes Black history, or maybe you want to redefine that. And like, if we don't recognize race, do we or should we teach Black history? So welcome back.
Thank you. So I really enjoy calling on Morgan Freeman, the wiseness of Morgan Freeman, when he had that,
the voice of God,
when he had that really popular clip and soundbite of him talking about how he doesn't want a Black History Month. Mm-hmm. It's American history, right? So my answer is kind of along the lines of Morgan Freeman, but slightly more complicated. So I'm going to flesh it out. The reason we have Black History Month, or the reason we have this thing called Black History, is because of racism. That happening is a product of racism, right? Mm-hmm. Racism had it set up so that the tenuous history of racism in the country wasn't generally being taught. And so as a solution to that, things like Black History Month get put into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to teaching, of course, the history of racism, you learn about Black inventors, you learn about black thinkers, you read Black writers, all of the things that are assigned to the category of Blackness. So, and the reason why it becomes important then, or becomes necessary, is because, again, these histories, these voices aren't generally being taught on a year-round basis. So, because of how racism operates in this country. So, let's solve that by having a Black History Month where everyone on a national level can participate and do this thing and focus on sharing this other information that otherwise is probably going to be left out.
Mm-hmm.
So, and similarly, I went to Howard University, a historically Black university, and the reason the university exists is because of racism, right? Racialized Black people weren't allowed at the other institutions. And so all of these HBCUs get funded and proliferate around the country because we wanted to be educated still, right? In these formal ways. And just because integration happens doesn't mean that the institution should close down, right? And it doesn't mean that the institutions prevent other people or other populations from coming to the institutions, right? Like, it is integrated. It's certainly more integrated now than it was at their inceptions. But the reason these institutions exist or were created, and the reasons we have things like Black History Month, is because those happenings were required because of how racism operated in this country. In a better version of this, the history would be integrated, right? It would be integrated so that year round, in an English class and a history class, students are learning the same things that get confined to just 1 month. They're learning it year round, and it's a more balanced presentation of the complexity of American history and who America is. Which would then mean that we would no longer need a Black History Month. And it would have the positive effect of integrating how we see ourselves and each other as well. Because the segregation of it, it being especially something like Black History Month, the continued segregation of it is also encouraging us to think of ourselves in continuously segregated racialist ways that manifest itself as a continued upholding of racism and racist practices. This idea that it's sufficient enough to confine certain types of histories or knowledge to a single month. And this idea that information is not an integral part of American history,
right,
and by extension is not American history. I think we continue to uphold racism by thinking about it in these ways and practicing these things in the ways that we do, because it really does teach young people, and then as adults, this is what we tend to think. It really does teach us to see the practice or problem of racism as distinct and separate, as well as people racialized as Black as distinct and separate from Americanness. And I don't know how much we got into that last time, but that's at the core and the center of a lot of the problems we see happening now.
Yeah, so I'm curious what your K-12 experience was with, again, quote unquote, black history. And I don't think there's any reasonable argument to say that the way that we have been teaching history for decades is certainly at least to some extent, incomplete, and it's different from place to place, and different curriculum pieces and places and those kinds of things. I know I'm an old crusty dude, 52 years old, and so I went to K-12 most of my middle and high school, and I graduated high school in '87. And back in the '80s, I remember quite a bit of what would be considered Black history, and I don't even think Black History Month was a thing at that point. Maybe it was. I don't know when it was instituted. So it's not like all I learned was white history, but certainly more heavy on what I would say is, again, white history versus a more complete version. And that excludes not just, people of African descent, but of all kinds of other descent, right? I mean, there's lots of other minorities as well. So certainly my history experience as a student was heavier on the majority, white American experience with, I would say, a fairly substantial amount, but not nearly as much as probably should have been. I'm curious what yours was, being a little bit younger in the tooth, perhaps.
Yeah, so I'm almost 40, and I can say with the utmost confidence that I don't remember a lot of what I learned in K through 12. Okay, like most people,
That's a
right?
whole other podcast,
Um,
Sheena.
I don't remember what all of what I learned, but I do remember very distinctly learning about slavery. I
Mm-hmm.
remember every year it inevitably came up. I couldn't tell you the time of year. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think Black History Month was a thing when I was coming up, but I do remember every year, you know, like clockwork, learning about slavery
Mm-hmm.
and feeling. And I remember because I grew up in a school with mostly racialized white people, and I remember feeling eyeballs on me, and I remember the discomfort that I felt
Hmm.
because I remember the correlations were made between me and the people that we were reading in the book that were slaves. And
Hmm.
it was just I didn't talk with my classmates about it that I remember, but I just remember feeling uncomfortable and feeling like the general feeling for everyone was discomfort,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but that's really the primary thing I remember learning in
Mm-hmm.
terms of history, for my K through 12 experience. Um, and I think what gets left out of conversations like this is like the awareness of the fact that what we learned during those formative years is important, but there's also something to be said about the fact that we continue to build on that knowledge in college or after we graduate, after graduation, in ways that tend to stay with us more.
Hmm.
And I'll say more because even then, as an undergraduate, long enough time ago, I don't remember everything that I learned there, right? But I do remember like some specific things and things that I was more interested in compared to other things and things like that. And certainly was always building on my knowledge, but I sometimes get the impression when this conversation comes up that people tend to view it as a sort of all or nothing game.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, we can only teach K through 12, that age range, we can only teach but so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are we being realistic, or are we thinking that we can literally teach the entire history of the entire world, from K through 12 and have that means more, for that age group? But then also, I don't look at history as white or black, as you would guess and already sort of preface with. So the history that I did learn, including the history about slavery and abolition and Civil War and all that, um, was history that was essential. It obviously did remain with me, and I did build on that knowledge as I grew older. Um, but would I have liked to have read Zora Neale Hurston or something like that instead of
Mm-hmm.
5,000 Shakespeare books or something? Sure, but I also was an avid reader, so kind of an anomaly. I was reading Dean Koontz and, Tom Clancy and Stephen King and stuff I probably wasn't supposed to be reading at very young ages, but I read anything that I could get my hands on,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and in this day and age, I feel like reading is undervalued. So to some extent, I care less about what is being read, more about how it's being taught. And I think the how it's being taught is the primary point of contention here for me, as opposed to this getting into the specifics of what is being read.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think that's true as well. I mean, there are certainly things, the Tulsa Race Massacre being the most recent sort of thing in the news, and I don't remember learning about that. But there's also lots of quote unquote white history that I didn't learn about, and because we do have to make some choices and things like that. That's not to say that we shouldn't have learned about Tulsa Race Massacre. We probably should have, and there's lots of things that I think demand or deserve, maybe is a better word, to be in that sort of set of curriculum. But like, how do we teach, and sort of what are the dynamics and the lessons? As a former U.S. history teacher, like, I was never, and still am not to this day, somebody who remembers or asks my students to remember, really tons of dates and names and things like that, and I'm not particularly good about that myself. But it's more important to me, like, why is this important? Why was that person important? Why was the Tulsa Race Massacre important? If we're looking at that as a historical event, let's look at why it's important and how it affected the various people and the players, and why why was there a bustling community of people who would be identified as racialized black, and why was that burned down, and what effects did that have on the community and those people going forward? And so getting into those questions, whether it's Tulsa Race Massacre or whatever we might say is more white history or something like that, I think is more important. And so one of the things that I think is an interesting dynamic, or I guess question here, that, and I think you and I have exchanged some likes or whatever on Twitter with some people as I interact and you interact, and the idea of race as a social construct is something that some people really believe is really, really important, or they vehemently and vigorously push back on a skeptic, eliminativist position. If you are listening to this and haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, you may be wondering what the heck that is. Go back and listen to that. We don't have time to get into it. But that being said, I do wonder and think, is there, I guess it's a question that I'm sure you have wrestled with, at least to some extent, and probably more so, is like, what's the functional utility, if any, of that position? Like, clearly people see race as a social construct, I would say, as a majority in the country. I don't think the majority of people are naturalist and reconstructionist. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think most people are skeptic and eliminativist. I would say most people are in the constructionist and conservationist sort of position. And again, if you think that's not correct, I'd love to hear that as well. But like, if people are in that position, if the ideal goal of the theory of racelessness is to move them to skeptic and eliminativist, is there some functioning utility in those sort of social construct positions, and how do we sort of recognize that, or I don't know, value it if it's worth valuing as we ideally move towards racelessness? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. I'm laughing because I find humor in everything, so don't mind me. Okay, couple of things. So regarding the sort of default philosophies of race in American society, it would actually be constructionist, reconstructionist. And
okay.
Now some of the categories are not mutually exclusive, meaning if you are a reconstructionist, you are a conservationist because you're wanting to keep the idea of race, but you're wanting to reconstruct it. So it's not, conservationist, reconstructionist positionalities are not mutually exclusive. There are some categories that are, right? Like, you can't be a conservationist and eliminativist, right? Or you can't be a naturalist eliminativist, because you really can't eliminate what's in nature unless you're talking about genocide, like literally.
Right.
So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure.
The typical position would be constructionist, reconstructionist, and I also want to point out that that skepticism is not a requirement or prerequisite for being an eliminativist.
Okay,
skeptics are often eliminativists, but constructionists are eliminativists too. My mentor at Howard University, Jacoby Carter, is a constructionist eliminativist. When I met him and I first started sharing my ideas and learning about philosophies of race, I identified myself as a constructionist eliminativist. So the difference was that I worked from inside of the category while seeking its destruction, because what Dr. Carter helped me recognize is that there's a difference between functional utility, there's a difference between utility, practical utility, and benefit and value. There's a difference there. So while people have historically worked within the category of race and made it work as best they can for themselves and for other people who look like them, that is utility, but there's nothing beneficial about being racialized. Right? When you come to really understand the history of racism and the history of the idea of race, the way the concept of race has been reconstructed, the way that racism is race, you come to find that actually this idea of reconstructing racism doesn't make any sense, because that's what the call is for if we're trying to reconstruct race, because to my mind it's the same thing. And yet, and still, one can still view race as a construction and seek its elimination. And so I don't tend to contend with constructionist viewpoints, except for the fact that as it's practically applied, because if I think of Ibram X. Kendi, he would be a constructionist, reconstructionist. How his ideas and ideas like his get applied, that's where things fall apart. And that's where constructionism falls short for me, because constructionists will say till they're blue in the face that race is a social construction, but then they say it's skin color. They say that people can see race. So it's like they'll tell me you're lying to yourself and pretending like race doesn't exist when people can see it.
Colorblind.
Right. If you are a constructionist, your view and perception of race shouldn't be in naturalist terms. Because if you start making it about an actual body and how a person looks, or their ancestry, their parents, etc., then you are taking a naturalist position, but you're packaging it as a constructionist one. And I think the light bulb I see is kind of going off for you, Drew, and hopefully for listeners. That is why a constructionist position falls very short of the end goal in terms of helping more people transcend racism. Because we're calling it a construction, but we're rooting it in biology, and it's a misidentification of what biology is, what skin color means. Because geneticists, all of the credible ones, which fortunately there are more credible ones than not, agree and say outright that race doesn't exist. It's not biological. That means it's not biological by skin color, it's not biological by hair texture or facial structure or anything. Right. It's not biological. It's not biological through sickle cell. People try to say, oh, well, what about the ways that race benefits people with certain medical conditions? That those ideas have been completely dispelled by actual science and medicine, fortunately. But it's still, we're calling it a construction, but what the naturalist conception of race is still happening. It's still going on. It's still persisting, which is why we continue to find ourselves in these quagmires. But so I do a lot of work, and I sound like a broken record when speaking with a lot of people, because I have to help them tease apart the idea of race and what they believe race is, and the very, scientific understanding of what ethnicity includes, which includes ancestry and phenotype and all this stuff. Why the distinction matters, because there are 5 racial groups, but there are countless ethnicities, right? And a lot of times that the ethnicities cut across and defy our conceptions of race in a lot of really important ways. And so it's important to help people recognize that. But once people have that type of knowledge, more often than not, I find constructionists to be persuaded by an eliminativist position, and oftentimes they end up switching or growing into skepticism. Which is literally how my own process went. I went from a constructionist to a skeptical position. And it's easy once you have the knowledge. But the fact that we continue to teach race in the ways that we do, the fact that we even teach history, everything is segregated. We continue to uphold the apparition of race, which is the primary problem.
Right.
And I think you asked me earlier something that I never really got around to answering, but I think I of course worry about what gets taught in schools, right? In any school, but especially K through 12. I do think about that, and I worry about that, and I have some ideas about that. But a lot of the problem is coming through the DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion training that the teachers and the staff and the administration are getting at the schools. And then they're taking those ideas, right? Usually it's CRT influenced, or it's being something that's being called CRT. They're taking that learning and then they're applying it to their own curriculum. And sometimes they're getting the curriculum from the DEI specialist or a similar entity. Right. But oftentimes it's really that they get the DEI training, so they have all of these conceptions and philosophies of race. And then they unintentionally, in most cases, end up teaching racism because the DEI practices are upholding naturalist, constructionist ideas of race. And if we can reach more teachers, we can reach any teacher and teach them the alternative philosophies and give them a toolkit to help their students de-racialize themselves, because probably by now they're already racialized. So help them de-racialize themselves and see themselves first and foremost as human. And then we can analyze the problem in a sort of historicized idea of what race is or how race operates because of racism. That to me is a difference that matters and gives more people what they want, because right now the problem is largely that people don't know there's a different way to do it. Right? So we're trapping people into thinking there's only a constructionist, reconstructionist way to do this thing, and there's not. And we can do it a different way, still teach the reality, in the history, but we don't have to do it in a way that keeps the history going, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, so what distinctions do matter, I guess, maybe is a question. So one of the things I had said in a tweet that you and I had similarly engaged with, or I think it was with somebody else, but you had been a part of, was sort of this reification, or I'll just say that, reification of race, right, of that social constructivist, which is, I think, in large part, really, they mean skin color. And I was struck, I don't know if you'd seen, I was not aware of him, and I'm a musician and a music lover, and so I can't imagine how I wasn't aware of Clarence Avant. I don't know if you know Clarence Avant. On Netflix, there's a documentary I watched last night. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. It's wonderful in so many ways. I think you would especially enjoy it. Clarence Avant is, as the Netflix show is titled, The Black Godfather. And his influence on music is where it kind of started, but actually he is sort of listed as a kingmaker and had a big part in getting Obama elected and Bill Clinton elected, and some really interesting pieces in there. But one of the things, certainly in the title, right, The Black Godfather, because you can't say The Godfather, because that's a different movie, right? What do you say? The racialized Black Godfather? I don't know if that plays particularly well in the Netflix queue, right? Maybe it does. I don't know. You'd probably click on it, but the idea of there are distinctions worth paying attention to, right? There are things, and some of those things are culture. Some of those things are. I mean, there are other things. I'm curious, sort of what are the things that we pay attention to, and how do we identify people, and even to that. And I have gone to sort of a regular practice of. And I tell my daughters this too, unless the skin color is important in telling a story, and if you're identifying somebody, then why would you include it, right? And why would you necessarily use that as as an important indicator? That being said, there are times when it's pretty easy, I was at a soccer game and I was trying to identify a player on the other team. I said, boy, she's really good. And they said, which one? It was number 10. She was also the only person, girl with darker skin, so like, how do you identify that person, and what distinctions matter, right? I mean, she does have darker skin, and it would be like, oh, the girl who with darker skin, or you typically say the black girl, right? So like, what are the distinctions that matter, and how do you think through that sort of identification?
So in other countries, what Americans conceive of as race, which skin color is a proxy for race, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is a sort of it's a descriptor. It's a matter of fact. It is rooted in a naturalist conception of race. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of fact. It's a statement of, you're black and I'm white, right? It doesn't have any other meaning attached to it. There's no presumption of culture, ethnicity, nationality, language, what type of food you like, nothing. It's just a statement of fact. We don't have that luxury in the American context, because that is not how race ideology has been crafted. So when people ask me that type of a question, I'm like, okay, there are very few times where you actually have to call on and describe what a person looks like. Very few times. Mm-hmm. Percival Everett, my favorite contemporary writer, he said in an interview a decade or so ago, it was something to the effect of, he's a writer, he doesn't consider himself to be a black writer. Mm-hmm. He's like, if I'm in office or Home Depot or something, Staples, and the police are looking for me, you might say, oh, he's in the writing section. Oh, and he's also black, right? Mm-hmm. But in most other contexts, that information it doesn't help with anything, literally, except describing possibly what a person looks like. And even then, I have a friend, and he calls me his sensei. He's somebody who did my Free Your Mind educational program. And he says that he's not black because his skin is not literally the color black, just like any white person isn't white. So he actually, he and other people find that even as a descriptor, that it's not saying all that much that people presume it's saying. Yeah. Because you could still be any number of complexions, or like even based on how we look, it's more nuanced than just black or white or Asian or whatever.
Right. Years ago, let me stop you. I have a story I had to tell. So years ago, I was at a large assembly or something, and you remember, surely Will Smith was the Fresh Prince, and he was a rapper, but he had DJ Jazzy Jeff, right? Yes. And he was speaking to this whole group, I think it was students, and he was riffing on this whole thing of like colored people. He's like, I'm not black. I'm, not, like you said, like my skin color, as in I'm holding up my phone, the back of it is black. Like, that's not what color I am, or I am not that shade of hue or whatever. And he had this whole riff on colored people. He said white people are actually more colored than black people. Like he had this whole riff on it. I remember just DJ Jazzy Jeff, of all people, having this long diatribe about it. Anyways, I digress.
No, I'm gonna try to find that on YouTube after. No, because it's important, and we can be playful with it, but I think there's some truth in that, right? I think human beings generally like to make order out of disorder. Right. And so we prefer things to be black and white, pun intended, because then it's easier to understand, it's easier to digest. We have two choices, or in the case of race, we have five. And it's very clear and ordered, even though that's not a reflection of our actual reality. And if we got to a place where it was just a descriptor, though, and it wasn't like there was nothing being carried with it,
right,
and it was operating like it does in like Nigeria or Jamaica or something, then I of course wouldn't find any contention with it. But I don't see how we get there, considering the fact that racism is race in our society. It's like the exact opposite. It's not just a descriptor. It's all of this other things. It's this presumption that because I look a certain way, I participate in a particular culture, which, mind you, is also on a hierarchy because it's Black culture. It's this idea that there's something like white history and Black history instead of human history or American history. It's this idea that to be identified as an American, it's not sufficient for me as an African American to just call myself American. I have to put something else in front of it, which signals my race. Right. It's like, it's all of that. And because that's how it works in our society, and it has worked this way for centuries, no matter how we try and have reconstructed the idea of race to inflict less and less violence, it still is carrying all this other stuff. And there's it is the hierarchy. So I argue for the discontinuation of using language associated with race, like white, Black, etc., to describe other meaningful differences such as ethnicity or culture, or even how a person looks. And maybe once we get to past the point of completely undoing the concept of race, the language can be reintegrated and we can use it again to describe people. But my question is, why do we think that's the only way to describe people, or even the best way to describe people, or even a valid way to describe people? I feel like we have so much other language that we can actually use and call on, and we probably should, because if it's carrying racism with it unintentionally, then we're upholding that. And we also get it wrong when it comes to how we view culture as being a product of race, when it's not. Because if it was a product of race, then every racial group would have the same culture and the same, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's not even true. So why do we keep insisting on it?
It was interesting, so I'll go back to that soccer example. Again, I'm on the sidelines, I'm with a parent, or several parents, but one in particular, and I was just referring to, I was like, I think we've played this team before, and I think I remember, I think her number was number 10, whatever, and I was identifying, I was like, she was really good, and just using her, just talking about her in particular because of, something that was relevant to the game. And I remember I thought, this is an interesting potential experiment, right? So I purposely did not refer to her skin color when she was the only, quote unquote non-white kid out there, I think, or, maybe not, I don't know, but it was an easy way, in a typical way that somebody would say. And I said, I think I said number 10, and the parent next to me struggled to see the number and then said, oh, the Black girl. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, she has a number on, like, let's just actually use the number, right? Because, and they don't, I don't think mean anything by it, but it is kind of typical. It reminds me of years ago, I lived in California, and I got into a car accident. I was with my dog and going for a run, and I hit a car pulled in front of me in an intersection coming up a hill. I didn't see it, and I T-boned it. I hit it in the door, and as they turned left in front of me, I was in an area that was pretty rough. Lots of racialized Black people came out. The guy that I hit was racialized Black, and I remember, so we called the police, and I remember hearing people as a sort of crowd sort of started to sort of form around. And actually, it had me a little spooked. Was I heard somebody say, "Oh, when he saw it was a black person, I saw him speed up," which is absurd because there's no possible way that I would have actually tried to stop. Right, I don't want to hit anybody. I don't want to ruin my car or total my truck or whatever. But like those indicators and those, and I don't know if you would call that racism. And some people would say that can't be racism because they're racialized black and I'm white, and very not particularly interested in that conversation. But the ways in which we refer to people and note their differences. You talk about culturally black, and they talk about that in the Black Godfather. But then, interestingly, Clarence Avant was notorious for actually saying people are people, and artists are artists, and musicians are musicians. And he put all these quote unquote white artists on his label, and people are like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "They're amazing artists, and stop acting like I need to have only black people on it." So. I'm curious, as you sort of think about, we've talked about culturally black and, what that means, but then how do you think about, I think I know the answer to this, but like Nicole Hannah-Jones and the sort of politically black?
I'm sighing because I was just talking about 1619 Project before we got on. So I think I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think that because racism masquerades itself as race, it's the same thing. That where we see race and when we teach our children to see race, then we see race everywhere, which means we see racism everywhere because it's the same thing, like in the story that you just explained with the car accident. And I think that's problematic because racism is not actually everywhere. And it, in some ways, in teaching race by then extension racism in the ways that we do, we continue to uphold the problem because it does give people the strong feeling that racism is everywhere, that it rules the entire world and universe. And it would be one thing if that was a true statement, but it's not. So we're giving it far too much power.
Let me. What do you think of this? And I've said this before, maybe even said it in a first one, but like the idea that racism is everywhere, but not everything is racism. Is that a distinction that makes sense?
Well, it makes sense to me because essentially, by my own definition, again, I define racism as the belief in race, the belief that human beings are broken down into these categories as a construction or as a naturalist. To me, that is racism because, again, it's the same thing. Race is the hierarchy. Right. So anybody can be racist. Anything, I guess, could ostensibly be racist. But in that way, racism is everywhere because we believe in race. Like, Americans are so obsessed with color and race.
Right. Especially
which lately. They view as being the same thing. Like, we're so obsessed with it, which is really, nefarious because we don't often recognize the sameness of the things, and then that's what allows actual problems to persist. But I think as a whole, the problem of believing in this idea of race and upholding it everywhere, which then causes us and inspires us to see racism everywhere and to see people as perpetual victims or perpetual oppressors and all this other stuff, it's wholly part of the problem, the same problem that I work to help people through a theory of racelessness. Because the opposite of that is teaching people to see their racelessness, teaching young people to see their racelessness, to see their humanity, to see their shared humanity that has absolutely nothing to do with a person's skin color or how they look or anything like that, because we almost always have more in common than we have different. Right. And we like to talk about, let's elevate differences, let's embrace differences. But then the differences that people talk about elevating and embracing are racial, in quotation marks. Right. And race is racism. So what you're saying is I have to accept that racism is somehow part of my identity because I've experienced it. And I reject that notion wholesale. I reject the notion that because I look a particular way or am racialized a particular way, that I have to racialize myself, that I'm a victim, that I am, that my opportunities are fewer and far between, right? Because of who I am. I have overcome tremendous adversity.
Mm-hmm.
And while I might be exceptional or identified as exceptional by people who know me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I believe in the resiliency of the human spirit. And I believe that the reason why I got to where I am was at least in part because I believed that I could get to where I am.
Mm-hmm.
I always believed I could do whatever I wanted to do. And to teach our young people anything other than that is to set them up to suffer from racism,
mm-hmm.
right? Because racism is really, a lot of it is ideology and a lot of it is in our minds. And a lot of it is not necessarily borne out or supported by actual statistics and data at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be something we should be celebrating. But yet, when you start to talk about that, then you're problematic,
right,
or you're part of the problem, or you're ignoring this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, no, but we're precluded from seeing that or from being encouraged to talk about these things because racialist ideology works in the ways that it does.
Right.
And you know, so when I think of Black culture or whatever, I do what I encourage more people to do, which is I translate the race word. So I try to figure out what is the person actually trying to say when they're using a race word in there, right? So for Black culture, I go back to American culture. It's American culture. When you start talking about Black culture, you're talking about American culture.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're talking about American culture, that doesn't mean that all of America has the same exact culture or anything like that, but right. We do have the same history, so there's that.
Right.
But in terms of culture, it's going to be different depending on zip code, usually, right? Or region. Right. It's regional. It's class. Right. You know, and to be Black is not to be poor. But right. People talk about Black culture, and usually what they're talking about is like the culture that comes out of more impoverished neighborhoods, which isn't even a majority of racialized Black people. So how is it being called Black culture? Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't, when you really try to investigate and interrogate and question everything truly, these ideas don't hold water. Mm-hmm. And I've come to recognize that we would be better off if we recognized the culture as American culture. It's not racial. It's not, culture produces race because it produces racism, but it's not the other way around. So to call it Black culture and have it mean anything to do with race is my biggest hang up in terms of the language.
Yeah.
And I think we free ourselves from that by recognizing that we need to stop segregating ourselves in our own minds from each other, because that segregation has never meant equality. It has never meant equality. It will never mean equality. And that's not to say that we all need to be the same, because we're not all the same.
Right. But
our differences have nothing to do with race, contrary to popular belief. Mm-hmm. But it will have to do with racism if we continue to go down this path and promote constructionist, reconstructionist philosophies of race.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to get going, and it's related to your latest Newsweek piece, or your first Newsweek piece, one of first of hopefully many. Some of the things you just mentioned there. So again, the Black Godfather on Netflix, Clarence Avant, like really talked about lots of those things. I mean, talk about exceptional, and this guy who just came from almost nothing, you know, and some of the circumstances that you shared in the first episode or our first discussion, you know, it reminded me a little bit like he just was, I'm going to do this, like this is going to happen, which is, you know, again, exceptional, but he also really seemed to not to buy into this sort of idea of race in many ways, although there's some inconsistencies there. I think I would recommend lots of folks take a look at it, as well as looking at your Newsweek. Please, what's the title of that? Let's wrap up here and make sure that everybody has a chance to get to that and any other places and blah 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 and find you all the standard end of podcast stuff.
Sure. So the Newsweek piece is called Undoing Racism Means Undoing Race. If you find me on Twitter, Sheena Mason, PhD,
Mm-hmm.
or at Racelessness, you can find links to really all of my most recent publications, my website, all my podcasts, all
Yeah.
of that stuff. So find me on Twitter.
Yeah, and go back to listen to the first episode as well, and hopefully future episodes as we continue this conversation. Like I said, I know you got to go, so thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you very much.